Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for this special guest Shiur talk at Shomrei Adas in London. I see people joining us from all over, both from our community locally and from further afield. Tonight's talk is part of a series of Tanakh talks that we are doing as part of a series to accompany our communal project learning, our communal learning project for our 75th anniversary, learning through Tanakh as a community. And it's a real honor to have Rabbi Dr. Stuart Halpern with us this evening. But I was looking through my emails due to for you to come. I realized that I think you helped me as an academic advisor make sure that I actually graduated while you in my senior year, and I appreciate it for that. And really, it's an honor to have you here with us now in London. Rabbi Halpern is a senior advisor to the provost at Yeshiva University and also the senior program officer at the Strauss Center of Torah and Western Thought. Rabbi Halpern has edited many, many books, which I'm sure many of us have had the pleasure of learning from. I personally, a week doesn't go by where I'm not learning and reading from one of the books you have edited. Perhaps most personally is the newest book, Esther in America, a book, again, a fetishrift of many essays from high-profile contributors about the American experience and Esther's role in that. And Rabbi Halpern is a prolific writer and many various different platforms. You can hear other talks and other interviews he's done recently about the book and about many other topics. And really, it's an honor to have you with us this evening to give us a talk. Without further ado, over to you.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be with you. And I hope everyone is comfortable, because I was told that in your shul the week before Purim, you stay up all night learning Torah as if it was Shavuos. So I hope you're in a comfortable chair. So I don't know how many of you were following the second impeachment of our president here, or our former president in the United States, but the most viral moment of the proceedings was rather unexpected. Now, for those of you who I can see, I'd like to ask you to recreate, if you would, for me, what that viral moment was. Any idea what the moment was? There was a Jewish lawyer of former President Trump who would take a drink of water, and what would he do when he would drink from the water bottle? He would go like this with his other hand. You might have seen it. It was making the rounds in international media as if this was a major sensation. What was at issue? The question was whether former President Trump's lawyer was making a bracha on the floor of the Senate when he was drinking from his water bottle. And if he was making a bracha, was it a proper bracha? And was he holding a bottle cap in the hand he was putting on his head? Now, why was this remotely important? To me, the question this boiled down to was the question of how Jewish can a diaspora Jew be in a land that is not his or her homeland? So here you had a presumably modern Orthodox Jew who is a lawyer, who is acting in the public sphere outside of the land of Israel. And the question arose over his actions. Does he have to be so Jewish in what he is doing and how he is acting in the public sphere? So this question of must one be so Jewish in everything that one does in the diaspora is a key question that comes up throughout the ages. So recently in her award-winning book, the former New York Times reporter Bari Weiss wrote in her book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, that after the Pittsburgh Tree of Life shooting in her hometown, she started wearing her Magen David necklace proudly. She wanted to show how confident she was and how outward she was in her Jewish identity. But she said, this test of a Magen David test or a kippah test, can you wear your Judaism on your sleeve in the public sphere outside of the land of Israel? She's not so sure how that would go over in other places outside of the United States or even in the United States. Now, of course, this question is a global question beyond the land of Israel. A few years ago, the New York Times ran a story profiling the teeny tiny Yemenite Jewish community. There was a handful, one family of Jews still living in what essentially amounted to house arrest in Yemen, surrounded by constant threats of violence. And they were basically Jews in hiding. And the New York Times story profiled two brothers, Abraham Jacob and Suleiman Jacob. One was 45 and one was 55. And the younger brother told the reporter about how he grew his earlocks, his payas, but he tucked them into his headscarf so that he would be able to blend in with his surroundings. But the older brother The older brother wore his payot out. He wore them proudly. And he told the reporter from the New York Times, I have nothing to fear here. I fear no one but God. So this idea, this tension of how outwardly proud can one be of one's Jewish identity in the diaspora actually goes all the way back to the pages of our Tanakh. This is a story that was wrestled with. This is a question that was wrestled with, starting with Yosef. Yosef, of course, is the first, on some level, diaspora Jewish leader. And following his story, around 1,000 years later, we have two stories. We have the story of Esther, and we have the story of Daniel. Now, I presume that most of us are familiar with the story of Esther. If not, you have roughly a week from exactly now to go over and check it out again, do some chazara. But Daniel is a little less known. So just by way of contextualizing Sefer Daniel, the book of Daniel, Daniel was taken from among the young elite of the land of Israel a few years before the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. So a few years before 586 BCE, Daniel was taken along with some others to Bavel. And he lived first under Babylonian rule in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, then under Persian and Median rule. And he had a few adventures, shall we say, in the king's court. You might recognize him from such incidents as Daniel in the lion's den, which we're going to get into in a little bit. And he experienced some dreams of his own. He interpreted some dreams of King Nebuchadnezzar, which we'll get to as well. And his friends were actually thrown into a fiery furnace and saved. They survived, his three friends. He also interpreted what became a commonly used phrase in Western parlance, the writing on the wall. The phrase, the writing on the wall, comes from Belshazzar's feast, whereby Daniel was brought in to try to interpret what the writing on the wall was. Okay, so that's the book of Daniel in a nutshell. And what I would like to show you today, or tonight, is how the story of Yosef, the first diaspora Jew, is a story that heavily influenced how the other diaspora Jewish stories, that of Esther and Daniel, were composed. And they're actually striking literary and thematic parallels, commonalities between the two stories that will hopefully provide a convincing case that Esther and Daniel were directly influenced in terms of how they were told through the prism of the story of Yosef. And yet, there's more. We'll see at the end, a little bit of a spoiler alert, that the story of Esther and the story of Daniel have starkly different, maybe even oppositional views with regard to how to answer the question that we started with. How Jewish can one be? How Jewish must one be in the diaspora, outside of the land of Israel? Okay, so now let's jump in. We're going to start by looking at some parallels between the story of Yosef and the story of Esther. Let's jump in. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see it? Here we are, the lion, the pit, and the wardrobe. Okay, so here's some parallels, if you can follow along in the chart, with the Yosef story and the story of Esther. So we read it in the Yosef story. As to set the scene, Yosef was in jail at the time, and the Sar Hamashkim, Paro's butler, had been let out. He had returned to the king's court. And the Sar Ophim, he did not have such a happy ending. So we read, Vayhi bayom hashlishi, and it was the third day, Yom huledet Paro, vayas mishtel lechol avadav. So Paro made a party after the third day for all of his servants. And we read very similarly in the Megillah at the beginning, Mishnat shalosh l'macho asa mishtel lechol sarav avadav. Achashverosh, the king, after three something, in this context it's 3 years as opposed to 3 days, made a party for all of his servants. So quite a similar parallel between the two stories right off the bat. Then we're told, back on in the story of Breshit, in the story of Yosef, V'lo zachar sar hamashkim et Yosef v'yishkachayu. The butler who had met Yosef in jail, whose dreams Yosef had interpreted in prison, he did not remember Yosef, who he had met. And we read later on in Breshit Parak Mem Aleph, Vaydeber sar hamashkim et paro lemor al chata'ai ani maskir hayom. Whoops, I forgot Yosef. Now I remember the sin of omission I made in not reminding you earlier, Paro, when you needed your dreams interpreted, of this dream interpreter that I met in prison, namely Yosef. And in the book of Esther, we read also that Achashverosh zachar et Vashti ve'et asher asata. He remembered how he had deposed Vashti. So in both stories, there is the remembering of a non-Jewish character about something that allows for the rise to power of the Jewish character. The remembering of the Saramashkim allows for Yosef to rise to power, and the remembering of Achashverosh of what he did to Vashti allows Esther to come into the scene. Parallel number 3. We read the advice of Yosef to Paro, Yaseh Paro v'yafked pikidim ala aretz, v'chimesh et eretz Mitzrayim b'sheva shnei hasava, v'yikbetzu kol ochel hashanim hatovot. So Yosef's advice to Paro is to appoint officers, and they should gather food from all the good years to save them for when the famine hits. We know the story. Now, in the story of Esther, there is also the appointing of officers for the gathering of something, actually someone. But here we read that the officers were appointed, Kol nara b'tula tavat mar'eh. They were told to gather all the good-looking women. So in the time of Achashverosh, the same language was used as in the story of Yosef, but instead of gathering inanimate objects, namely food, they were gathering women. So clearly the text is trying to convey to you that in the time of Achashverosh, the women were thought of as commodities, not unlike foodstuffs gathered earlier in the time of Paro in Mitzrayim. Parallel number 4. In both, you could follow along either in Hebrew or in English, but in both stories, there is the riding on the chariot and parading through the streets of the Jewish character, one of the Jewish heroes. So we know, of course, that Yosef gets to ride on the chariot of the second in command of Paro, and Mordechai, of course, rides in the chariot as well, led by Haman. Now, parallel number 5, we read in the story of Yosef before he had landed in jail, he was in the house of Potiphar. Now, Potiphar's wife was a bit of a nudge. We read, Vayiki debra Yosef yom yom v'lo shama ela leshkavetz yotima. She wanted to seduce him, and she kept asking every day, over and over again, why won't you sleep with me? Why won't you sleep with me? And the story of Esther, we also have sort of a nudging non-Jewish character. We read, Vayhi kamram elav yom v'yom v'lo shama alehem, that Mordechai kept being nudged by the townspeople who were asking, why aren't you bowing down to Haman like everybody else? So there was this repetitive asking of the Jew and also a refusal. And that refusal was for, shall we say, unexpected reasons. What do I mean? Yosef, we're told, tells Eshe Potiphar, I cannot be with you, v'chatati l'Hashem. If I was with you, then it would be a sin against God. And that comes as a bit of a surprise because God's hand is not readily there. There are no miracles in the story of Yosef at this point. And yet he's invoking God and saying, I can't do this. This would be a sin against God. I have God very much on my mind. In the story of Mordechai, here too, his answer comes as a bit of a surprise. He tells the people he cannot bow down. He told them he can't bow down because he's Jewish. Now, it's possible that he had to explain that to them because the people of Shushan, didn't realize until he told them that he was Jewish. Now, this is a radical idea because you think like, okay, Esther was the one, we're often taught that Esther was the one with the hidden Jewish identity, not Mordechai. But if you think about it, Mordechai's name was not exactly a Yiddish name. I think is it Jackie Mason who talks about assimilated Jews in America, one by the name of Crucifix Finkelstein. I think it goes the routine. So the idea that there's a Jew named Mordechai, Marduk, a pagan god, is very much reflective of potentially assimilation within the polity of Shushan. And so it's possible that the people of Shushan didn't know until Mordechai had told them the reason he couldn't bow down to Haman was because he was, it turns out, Jewish. So in both stories, there are these surprising refusals due to religious reasons. They're religious objections, if you will. Parallel number 6, both stories contain a rather unusual word, vayitapak. We read of Yosef, vayarchatz panav vayitze vayitapak. He refrained himself before he revealed his identity to his brothers who had gone down to Mitzrayim. And vayitapak Haman vayavo al beito. Haman also refrains himself. So that's a rather unusual word that is rare, and it pops up in both the story of Yosef and the story of the Megillah. In both stories, parallel number 7, there's a slipping off of a ring. It's given to a character, one given to Yosef and another given to Mordechai and Esther. Parallel number 8, this is a bit of a cheat. I left Sefer Bereshit and went to Sefer Shemot for this one, but we read at the beginning of Shemot, Vayasimu olav sarei misim. The descendants of Yosef, the Jews, the Israelites, us, had been given taskmasters by Paro. they had been enslaved. And we're told that the shorish, the root word used for the taskmasters is sarei misim. And in the story of Esther, we're told by Yasim Hamelach Achashverosh mas, a similar word, mas and misim, ala art v'yeh hayam. Now, I don't know what the minhag is in your shul, Rabbi. Maybe you can give me a thumbs up if they do. Do people boo when they read this line? In my shul, in Englewood, New Jersey, when people read about taxes, there's a loud boo that matches the booing that happens with the mention of Haman. And so here there's this sort of unhappy ending on some level of the book of Esther, whereby the Jews are very much still stuck in a unpleasant situation. They're being taxed by foreign authorities. So here too, there's this bit of this negative tinge. There's this sarei misim in the story of Mitzrayim, and the mas, the tax, is in the story of Esther. Parallel number 9, we know, of course, that Yosef, when his brothers come to reunite with him, don't know at first that they're talking to Yosef. So they don't recognize Yosef. They don't realize his sort of hidden Jewish identity. And as we already mentioned, both Esther for sure has hidden Jewish identity. She's called Esther, not Hadassah, and people don't know till the end that she's a Jew. And Mordechai, we already mentioned how, and you could just scan the psukim with your eyes, we know that it's very possible that he was not overtly identifiably Jewish. The plot develops. Now, there's an interesting writer, Michael Eisenberg, who happens to be a venture capitalist living in Israel, but he wrote a book called The Vanishing Jew about the story of Esther, and he says that it's almost a bit of a tragic, at least beginning of the book, because Mordechai and Esther, it could very well be, are experiencing all these problems because they are Jews who are almost, if not ashamed of their Jewish identity, they're hiding their Jewish identity. They don't believe that in order to succeed in Shushan, one can, or maybe even should, wear one's Jewish identity proudly on their sleeve. They hide their Jewish identity. They have pagan names, Mordechai and Esther, Marduk and Ishtar, the names of pagan gods and goddesses. And at least it's possible to read their story as Mordechai wasn't, at least at first, identifiably Jewish, and Esther, we know, hid her identity. Now, of course, God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. That is much discussed, and nor are mitzvot. Even when the Jews fast, we're not told that they daven. Now, we presume, of course, that they daven, of course. And we presume, of course, that Hashem ended up helping them save the day. But in terms of the pshat of the story, the text itself does not indicate overt Jewish observance of mitzvot by Mordechai and Esther. But Chazal, of course, come along and explain how they actually were keeping the mitzvot. But at least it's possible to read the story as Mordechai and Esther both having some level of hidden Jewish identity, just like Yosef on some level hid his Jewish identity. So to summarize what we've seen so far, as the contemporary scholar Rachel Edelman puts it, in both these tales of Jew or Hebrew in the diaspora, God is conspicuously absent. No revelation, no prophecy, no miraculous intervention. Yet the divine hand is palpable beneath the mask of the Egyptian viceroy and the crown of the Persian queen, as Joseph and Esther negotiate their own visibility and invisibility. Now we're going to look at some parallels between the story of Yosef and the story of Daniel. So I mentioned before, Vayitapak, this rather rare word that only comes up a few times in Tanakh. And there's another word that pops up, a rare word that pops up in the story of Yosef and the story of Daniel, and that is someone's face being za'af, being distraught. So you could see, if you follow along in the Hebrew, V'hinam zo'afim and Pneichem zo'afim in the story of Daniel. Now in Yosef, it comes up in the context of seeing the Sarah Mashkim and Sarah Ophim who were distraught. And in Sefer Daniel, the context is, as I mentioned, Daniel and other sort of young rising star Jews had been taken into exile to Bavel, and there had been someone appointed over them to take care of them, kind of like the harem in the story of Esther. And so the job of the person overseeing Daniel and his colleagues was to make sure that they were healthy. And so the person in charge of them tried to give them food, and Daniel turned down the food because the food wasn't kosher. He didn't want to eat it. And the person in charge of feeding Daniel was very worried. He thought he would lose his job. He thought he would get fired. And he was distraught because Daniel wasn't eating the food that officer had been assigned to give him. And so there you have this distraught face of this officer, just like there's a distraught face in the story of Yosef. Parallel number 2 between the story of Yosef and the story of Daniel. We read about someone having the Spirit of God, Ruach Elokim, in both stories. Not exactly a common occurrence in Tanakh. Parallel number 3. Parallel number 3, I think, is a particularly fascinating one. So we know, of course, that Yosef interpreted dreams. He interpreted his own dreams about his brothers and his family. He interpreted dreams from the Sar Mashkim and the Sar Ophim. And he, of course, interpreted Paro's dreams. Now, Daniel, too, as I mentioned in the beginning, he also interpreted dreams. What's fascinating is he sort of out Yosef's Yosef. What do I mean? In the book of Daniel, and you can fact check this if you don't believe me, Nebuchadnezzar calls his advisors, and like the story of Paro and Yosef, asks for a dream interpretation, but he makes it even harder than Paro made it. What does he do? He asks his advisors to tell him what he, Nebuchadnezzar, had dreamed and the dream interpretation. So it's not only you have to solve this hard to decipher vision that the king had at night, but you actually have to he was asked to tell the king what the king himself had dreamt. And so on some level, you could say Daniel sort of one-ups Yosef in his ability to interpret dreams. But at the very least, they have this common theme of having this very special ability. And parallel number 4, and this is something already alluded to, Daniel, as we're going to see, got thrown into the pit, into the lion's den. And of course, Yosef, we know, got thrown into a pit by his brothers. So the fate of both at a certain point in their narrative was very much in the air. Now let's look at some commonalities between the story of Yosef and the story of Esther and the story of Daniel, things that they have all 3 stories in common. Okay, so all 3, you could follow along in my source sheet, but all 3, I'm just summarizing here, are exilic Jews. Obviously, that's what we started with. All 3 are Jews who are not in their homeland, not in the land of Israel. So we know that, of course, Yosef was sold either directly by his brothers, indirectly by his brothers, and landed in Egypt. Esther, of course, we know Mordechai and Esther, their ancestors had been exiled from Yerushalayim. And I already mentioned that Daniel, and you can follow along in the Psukim, but that Daniel had been taken and delivered to the king of Babylonia. So all 3 were exilic Jews ripped from their homes. Now, another common theme among all 3 stories is looks. What do I mean? So for those who I can see, raise your hand if you can tell me if we know what Avram Avinu looked like. Do we know if he had a beard, if he was bald? Raise your hand if you could tell me one physical description of Avram. So I don't see any hands raised. Why? Because of course we're not told anything about how Avram looked. We're more often than not told anything about how any characters look in Tanakh, except if the physical description of them has something to do with their plot. So, for example, Avshalom, the rebellious son of King David, what are we told about him? That he has very long hair. Why? Because later on in his story, he gets caught in a tree by his hair. So that's foreshadowed by us being told that he has long hair. So here in all 3 of these stories, we actually have an occurrence of being told something about these characters, namely the fact that they're good looking. We're told that Yosef is good looking. We're told that Esther is good looking, and she, of course, wins the beauty contest. And Daniel, despite refusing the food being given to him by the official in Babylonia, he is also good looking. And of course, the reason we're told that is because it all relates to the plot, to their narrative, as we've been discussing. Parallel number 3 between all 3 stories is that all 3 of the characters have dual names. All 3 of the heroes in these tales have both a Jewish name and a non-Jewish name. We're told that Yosef was given the name by Paro Tzafna Paneach. We know that Esther was also known as Hadassah, and Daniel was called Belteshazzar. So there's this dichotomy, not unlike many diaspora Jews to this day, who have both Jewish and non-Jewish names. So for example, every time I'm in a cab in Israel and the cab driver asks me my name in Hebrew and I say Stu or Stuart, he says to me, what kind of Jewish name is Stuart? And so this balancing of these dual identities is reflected in dual names is something that happens in all 3 stories that we're discussing today. Parallel number 4 between all 3 tales is the fact that in all 3 stories, there is a friendly eunuch. Okay, in the story of Yosef, we're told that Potiphar is Sris Paro, seemingly the eunuch or the official of Paro, and it is, maybe not surprisingly, the wife of Potiphar who tries to seduce Yosef. And in the story of Esther, we're told that she's taken care of by Haggai Sris HaMelech, also a friendly Saris. And in the book of Daniel, there is a Saris as well. Parallel number 5, as we mentioned, this I'll just summarize in the text. You can follow the psukim along. All three, there are characters who ride in the, who are appointed the second in command. So they are occupying the second level of authority in their respective political and monarchical context. Okay, parallel number 6. In all three stories, there is the disturbed sleep of the king that leads to the rise of the Jewish character. So we know, of course, that Paro allowed Yosef out of jail, or was brought out of jail, Yosef was, to interpret the dreams of Paro that he had, and he couldn't sleep. And Esther, of course, we know Achashverosh couldn't sleep and had the book of Chronicles read before him, and that's how he remembered that he hadn't yet rewarded Mordechai. And Daniel, as we mentioned, as we've already discussed, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. He had disturbed sleep that he needed solved. He needed Daniel to interpret his dreams. So in all three stories, what they have in common is the disturbed sleep of the king allows for the rise of the Jewish hero. Parallel number 7, and I've already mentioned the lions and pits, and now I had to get wardrobe in here somehow. So in all three of these stories, there is royal clothes. There is a royal wardrobe worn by the characters. So Yosef is dressed in royal clothes when he's removed from jail and cleaned up. Mordechai, of course, is given royal clothes to wear when the plot turns for the benefit of the Jews. And Daniel also, after he interprets dreams, and visions, he is given royal clothes as well. Parallel number 8, in all three stories, there is drinking. I don't have to elaborate on that. Parallel number 9 is, in all three stories, there are, if you see the Hebrew word that I underlined, chachamim, there is a role of wise advisors in all three contexts. Parallel number 10 is bowing. In all three of the stories, in the story of Yosef, the brothers come down to Mitzrayim, they reunite with Yosef, not realizing that it's Yosef, and they bow down to him. In the story of Esther, of course, the whole plot turns on Mordechai's refusal to bow down. And in Daniel, as I mentioned, Daniel's 3 friends are thrown into the fiery furnace. Why? Because they don't bow down. So in all three stories, there is that theme of who is going to bow down. Is this a good thing? Is this not a good thing? That the major characters have to navigate. So as the contemporary writer and journalist Mati Friedman writes in his book actually about spies in the land of Israel, but I thought it was appropriate for our share this evening. Double identity has always been part of life for Jews. Members of a minority, often outwardly indistinguishable from the majority. You wonder how much to show or hide at different times, how the sides of you fit, and whether it's possible to abandon one side altogether. So this is the navigating of identities that the diaspora Jewish heroes and heroines were doing in their tales that we've been looking at this evening. So for the last part of this year, the last few minutes, I want to look with you, I want to take a deep dive into that lion's den. I want to look at Daniel chapter 6, and I want to read it along with you. And I want you to think about how are ways that we've seen commonalities. Now let's think about differences. How is it that Sefer Daniel presents a model of Jewish difference that contrasts with that of the book of Esther? Okay, so let's jump inside. Daniel chapter 6. We read as follows. And the whole time I want you to be thinking, I want you to be wearing already your Purim costumes. I want you to be wearing your Mordechai and Esther crowns and thinking, putting yourself in that headspace, and keep that story in mind. We read as follows. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. It pleased Darius to appoint over the kingdom 120 satraps to be in charge of the whole kingdom. So you're reading 120, and it sounds kind of like what? What does it sound like? Sounds like 127 provinces that Achashverosh oversees when he's the king. So you wish, like, maybe it's like gematria, where you can be off by like 1 or 7. Actually, an early Greek translation of Daniel in this verse has 127 until 128. And the presumption is that whoever was translating the story in Greek wanted to align the story directly and exactly with the story of Esther. It's 120 satraps is a version of the pasuk that we have is the original, to be in charge of the whole kingdom. Over them were 3 ministers, one of them Daniel, to whom these satraps reported, in order that the king not be troubled. In other words, just like in the story of Esther, where there was a threat against the king's life, there was Bigtan and Teresh who tried to assassinate Achashverosh, as a direct result of that, Achashverosh said, I need people to cool down. Tempers are flaring too much in my kingdom. I'm going to put someone else in charge to take the heat off of me. I'm going to have Haman be the one in charge in some level, and everyone's going to bow down to him. So in case people want to be angry at some government official, it's not going to be me, it's going to be him. That's one suggestion as to why Haman got promoted so soon after the assassination attempt on Achashverosh. So to here we have a king saying, I don't want to be troubled by angry citizens. I'm going to put other people in charge. Let's keep going. Pasuk Dalet. This man, Daniel, surpassed the other ministers and satraps by virtue of his extraordinary spirit, and the king considered setting him over the whole kingdom. The ministers and satraps looked for some fault in Daniel's conduct in matters of state, but they could find neither fault nor corruption, inasmuch as he was trustworthy and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. In other words, Daniel he was a nice, firm boy. He had a sterling reputation. Those men then said, we are not going to find any fault with this Daniel unless we find something against him in connection with the laws of his God. In other words, in contrast to the book of Esther, whereby we said it's possible to read the story in a way that indicates that Mordecai and possibly Mordecai, definitely Esther, were not recognized by the general citizenry as Jewish. Everyone knows that Daniel is Jewish. Everyone knows in his story, Daniel is a guy who davens outside with his talis and tefillin on, and everyone knows it. Then these ministers, let's keep going, Pasuk Zayin, then these ministers and satraps came thronging into the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the ministers of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, companions, and governors are in agreement that a royal ban should be issued under sanction of an oath, that whoever shall address a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, during the next 30 days shall be thrown into a lion's den. In other words, we have this list, this endless list of advisors and officials hanging out, buzzing around the king, just like in the story of Esther, where constantly Achashverosh has to consult his long laundry list of advisors. And we're told they make a law. They make kind of a weird law, kind of like their weird laws in the beginning of the book of Esther about wives having to obey their husbands and speak their language. Also here, there's a rule that's enacted. You can't pray to anyone. You can't daven to anyone except for the king. And if you are, you get thrown into the lions then. So issue the ban, O king, and put it in writing so that it be unalterable as a law of the Medes and Persians that may not be abrogated. Just like in the story of Esther, you have a rule that can't be changed. Once it's issued, that's it. You can't change it. Pasuk 10, thereupon King Darius put the ban in writing. When Daniel learned that it had been put in writing, he went to his house. In whose upper chamber he had windows made facing Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he knelt down, prayed, and made confession to his God as he had always done. In other words, let's take a step back. What's the rule? The rule is don't daven. You can't daven to anyone except for the king. So what does Daniel say? He gets the text, he gets the WhatsApp, new rule in the kingdom, no davening. Daniel says, okay, got it. I'm going to go daven mincha now. And not only does he do that, he does it at the window facing Yerushalayim. So all of that is in contradistinction to the story of Esther. In the story of Esther, of course, as we mentioned, there's no God, there's no visible God, there's no mention of God, there's no davening, and the whole story is taking place outside of the land of Israel, and no character is even thinking about the land of Israel. Now, certain contemporary Israeli scholars, like Rabbi Menachem Leibtag and Rabbi Yoni Grossman, have pointed out that it's possible the entirety of the Megillah is a satire making fun of the Jews for not thinking about Yerushalayim enough. And Michael Eisenberg, in the book that I mentioned, he suggests, I think Rabbi Bini Lau in the introduction to the book actually says in their shul, or in his shul, and Mincha on Purim, to sort of fix the mistake of Mordecai and Esther in not leveraging their political power and bringing the Jews back to the land of Israel at the end of their book. They actually read the first 2 parakim of Nehemiah, another much less famous biblical book, but the Israelis appreciate that book. Why? Because Nehemiah, also a Jewish official in the Persian government, does lead the Jews back to the land of Israel. So they read that at Mincha on Purim because they want to show you that this story, this idea of dwelling too much in the exile is not a good thing. It's not a good ending for Jews at the end of the tale. So for Daniel, this is not a problem. Daniel has his libo b'mizrach. He has his sights set on Yerushalayim. Okay, let's pick the story back up. Pasuk Yud Bet, verse 12. Then those men came thronging in and found Daniel petitioning his God in supplication. So sure enough, of course, it's very possible Daniel was doing this just to be caught. He davened the window, and lo and behold, he got caught red-handed. They then approached the king and reminded him of the royal ban. Did you not put in writing a ban that whoever addresses a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, during the next 30 days shall be thrown into a lion's den? The king said in reply, the order stands firm as a law of the Medes and Persians that may not be abrogated. Thereupon they said to the king, Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, pays no heed to you, O king, or to the ban that you put in writing. 3 times a day he offers his petitions to his God. He's super frum. You told people that they can't be frum anymore. Upon hearing that, the king was very disturbed, and he set his heart upon saving Daniel, and until the sunset, made every effort to rescue him. So here the king, kind of like the story of Achashverosh, remembering he had to do something good for Mordechai, is trying to figure out, how can I protect this Jew that I like, that has earned favor in my eyes? Verse 16, then those men came thronging into the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that any ban that the king issues under sanction of oath is unalterable. So they effectively say to him, hello, you just signed this law. You just told people that they can't do it. He did it. I'm really sorry. There's no out for this guy. By the king's order, Daniel was then brought and thrown into the lion's den. The king spoke to Daniel and said, your God whom you serve so regularly will deliver you. So the king was hoping that Daniel would make it through somehow. Verse 18, a rock was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his signet and with the signet of his nobles, so that nothing might be altered concerning Daniel. The king then went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and his sleep fled from him. So in the story, we have disturbed sleep, just like in the other story, just like in the story of Esther. Instead, though, in contrast of the king who's constantly partying and feasting in the book of Esther, here we have a king who's fasting. We have a king who's schwitzing over, is Daniel going to be saved by his God? Verse 20, Pasuk Chaf. Then at the first light of dawn, the king arose and rushed to the lion's den. As he approached the den, he cried to Daniel in a mournful voice. The king said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, was the God whom you served so regularly able to deliver you from the lions? Daniel then talked with the king. O king, live forever. My God sent his angel who shut the mouths of the lions so that they did not injure me, inasmuch as I was found innocent by him. Nor have I, O king, done you any injury. In other words, I did not compromise on my Judaism, and I did not compromise on my faithfulness to you. So I'm able to be both a proud Jew and a loyal citizen of your realm. The king was very glad and ordered Daniel to be brought up out of the den. Daniel was brought up out of the den. No injury was found upon him, for he had trusted in his God. So again, unlike in the book of Esther, where God is not mentioned, we are told directly that he trusted in God and God rewarded him for it. Then by order of the king, those men who had slandered Daniel were brought, and together with their children and wives, Taf Vinashim, I guess you would say, if you were quoting the book of Esther, it reminds you of this constant mention of Tav Vinashim in the book of Esther, were thrown into the lion's den. They had hardly reached the bottom of the den when the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all peoples and nations of every language and inhabit the earth. Again, this idea of writing letters in different languages to people all across the kingdom is obviously something that reminds us of the book of Esther. May your well-being abound. I have hereby given an order that throughout the royal domain men must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God who endures forever. His kingdom is indestructible and his dominion is to the end of time. So the king here effectively gives a Dvar Torah, and he tells his whole kingdom how wonderful and incredible the Jewish God is. And you can read the rest of the story about how Daniel prospers. So as Yoram Hazoni points out in his very excellent book on the book of Esther that I highly recommend, he says as follows. According to this way of looking at things, he's talking about Sefer Daniel. There is no need for the Jew to make even the smallest compromise on any of his principles to advance in a foreign court, because political success depends entirely on scrupulous observance of traditional Jewish ritual and faith. In other words, Daniel kept the mitzvot and was saved for it and flourished because of it. Thus, keeping kosher miraculously makes Daniel and his fellows stronger and more handsome than those who eat the meat served by the Babylonian king, and their refusal to follow state laws that conflict with Judaism is of no consequence. The death penalty miraculously fails to work when applied to Jews, and a swift demise awaits those who attempt to enforce it. The secret to success is therefore piety in its most obvious forms. Sacrifice nothing to the law, and salvation will come from heaven, without much waiting or speculation required to see it. So that is the ethos, that is the character of the book of Daniel. But as Adam Kirsch now at the Wall Street Journal, puts it in his own book, The People and the Books, 18 Classics of Jewish Literature. He talks about Esther and how people nowadays relate to Esther, maybe even more than Daniel. The message of these stories could not be clearer. Jews in the diaspora are given great opportunities. After all, Daniel rises to become a chief royal counselor, but they are constantly tempted by the temptation to renounce their religion, to act more like the people around them. It is a Jewish duty to resist that temptation and remain faithful to Jewish practices, even to the point of martyrdom. That's Daniel. God is watching over the Jews and will make sure that any sacrifice for his sake is rewarded. What makes the book of Esther so powerful, however, what separates it from almost every book in the Bible and enables it to speak immediately to the modern reader is its rejection of each of these consoling pieties. Esther too tells the story of Jews under Persian rule and of the temptations and challenges they face. Here again are Jews who undergo exile, adopt non-Jewish names, and rise to positions of influence. They are challenged to bow down to their enemies and forsake their ancestral customs. But in Esther, God is not there to intervene and rescue people from the fiery furnace. Instead, it is only very good luck, a series of fortunate coincidences that allows Esther and her uncle Mordecai, cousin Mordecai, to prevent a wholesale genocide of the Jews of Persia. And I think, of course, the ultimate prism for this is the fact that these characters are, as we started, diaspora Jews. As Yoram Hazoni, who lives in Israel, puts it, in exile, whether in ancient Persia or in a more contemporary one, whether it's England, whether it's America, Jewish life must somehow persist without the immense resources made available by independent sovereign power. In exile, Jews must live in dispersion, their institutions weak, their concerns wandering far from Jewish things, and their politics alienated from every obvious source of cohesiveness, direction, and strength. It is clear at the outset that under such conditions, there is no possibility of freely seeking and implementing any Jewish ideal. To live in a society ruled by others means that the government and the laws are not the product of Jewish concern for the general public interest, and that they are certainly not the result of an interest in the well-being of the Jews as a nation. That Jewish intellectual endeavors are under constant pressure, whether overt or implicit, to conform to alien norms, and that Jewish leadership, if it is capable and effective, is perpetually viewed with a certain measure of suspicion and even fear, both by the community of non-Jews and by members of the Jewish community concerned that Jewish success may be interpreted by the Gentiles as a challenge to their authority. Thus, exile, while never precluding entirely the possibility of Jewish power, nevertheless establishes a formidable presumption against it. So as we've seen today, we've looked at three exilic narratives. We've seen how Daniel and Esther approach the question effectively asked by the story of Yosef. Must a Jew or can a Jew flourish in the exile by being Jewish in everything he or she does? So the answer to that question, it seems, is a bit of a range. To the answer, must a Jew be Jewish in everything that he or she does, Daniel would, of course, give a resounding answer of yes, of course. Whereas Esther's story would be significantly less clear. Either way, hopefully, by learning these stories together this evening, a week before Purim, we've taken steps to precede the ultimate redemption, whereas we will all live in Israel, where the question of how to survive and flourish as a diaspora Jew will no longer matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stuart Halpern. Would you be open to take some questions if people have?
Absolutely.
Those who have a question either want to post in the chat or unmute yourself. You did have a request I saw in the chat to someone you could post the bibliography, the books you mentioned. I don't know if that's a possibility.
Sure, I can also, I'm happy to email you.
Lionel has a question. Lionel's
Sure.
going up.
Thank you, Rabbi Halpern. Excellent talk. Very thought-provoking. Incidentally, I loved your book, Gleanings, which my wife bought for my birthday.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Obviously, this Esther book is next on the list. You portray, or the people that you've quoted portray Daniel as like a paradigm, but I mean, had things not turned out so well, Halachis might have looked at him and said, well, he did something that actually negligent, and really he lost his life when he shouldn't have done, and we shouldn't be so free and easy and so super frum. There is a medium line that we're meant to take, and I think there are rabbis that teach us how to do that.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that you bring that up, and thank you. And I would definitely say that there's poles, and I would say you could maybe argue that on some level Esther and Daniel are poles, and we live somewhere in the middle. And the way you express it so beautifully reminded me of the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, where the sort of less famous part is where there's a question of, how frum should the rabbis be to stave off the destruction from the Romans, and should they bring a korban in a certain way or not a certain way, and how will that play out? And there, essentially, the destruction ends up happening. The temple is destroyed, and the rabbis hold up a mirror to themselves and say, maybe we shouldn't have been so medoctic on certain things, because that ultimately led to negative things happen. So I think there's a range. I mean, this has been a conversation going on for the better part of 3,000 years, and I think it will no doubt continue.
Any other questions? People raise their hands, unmute yourself. You head on the chat. I want to ask, would it be possible to share the Makoro? I don't know if that's...
Absolutely, yes. I'd be happy. Rabbi, I'll send it to you, and be happy to have you pass it along.
Okay, so those who want it, be in contact with myself or Josh or Lionel from the shul. We can pass this on to you. Thank you so much again for that really fascinating shiur. Definitely a good preparation, thought-provoking as we get into this Purim, especially in the current political climate we find ourselves.
Thank you so much for having me. Really an honor
very much.
to learn with you.
Thank you everyone for joining.
Rabbi Shmuley, what's our next Tanakh talk?